Hey everybody, and welcome to Storms on the Way. I'm Alistair Stevens, and this is our 10th session of Storms on the Way. We're looking at the novel again in this session. Our schedule has been a little confused. Hey everybody, and welcome. It's fine. Everything's going to be fine. We're going to catch up, and this is our 10th session. Today, we're looking back at the novel. We're looking at the novel again in this session. Our schedule has been a little confused. Hey everybody, and all of chapter 8 on the way. I'm fine. We're going to catch up, and this is our 10th session. Today, we're looking back at the novel again, and our schedule has been a journey through. Hey everybody, and all chapter 8. If we have time at the end of the session, I'd like to take a moment to consider what part 1 of American Gods is. What is the journey that Shadow has undertaken to get to this point? What transformations has he undergone? How is it different here at the end of chapter 8 than it is right at the beginning of chapter 1? I think there's some space there for some very interesting speculation, and if we don't make it to that today, we'll get to it next time. Good. Everything seems to be working. Are we getting audio insanity again? No, this is terrible. Okay, this happens from time to time, you guys. I'm terribly sorry. Give me just 1 second. Everything seems to be working. Are we getting hopefully fix it? This is a YouTube problem. It's just okay, disastrous. This happens from time to time. I'm terribly sorry. Figure this out here. Okay. Yeah, we're getting some. I may have to cancel this and relaunch a new one. Hopefully I won't. Last time I was able to save this before it all went weird, but okay. Let me see now. Whoops. Let me see now if this is going to... Okay, I can change this very quickly. And then hopefully that should fix it. Let's find out. Technical issues. It's fixed. We've got it. Good. Good, I'm very glad. I'm glad that that is the case. Okay, there are like 3 different things that you can try to fix that, so I just did all of them. Apparently the first one worked. Okay, good, good. All right, so what I'll do is I'll put an edit point in here, and then for the podcast, I'll just start as though none of this ever happened. This is the magic of how you make podcasts, I guess. Thank you all so much. Good, good. I'm really glad that's all working. It's still an imperfect science, is all I can say about this. Okay, so from the top, here we go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Storms on the Way. This is the 10th session of our journey through American Gods. We are looking both at Neil Gaiman's seminal novel and, of course, at the recent Starz adaptation. Our schedule has been a little confused over the course of the last week, but don't worry. Over the course of the next couple of days, we're going to pick right up. We'll catch up with the TV show. Everything will be good. In this session, we are going to be looking at Chapter 8 of the novel. Well, I guess, technically, the very end of Chapter 7, and also Chapter 8 of the novel. We're going to look at Salim and the Ifrit, and then we're going to look at well, Shadow's respite, Shadow's time in Cairo, Shadow's time with Mr. Ibis and Mr. Jackal, and we're going to look, in the context of Chapter 8, at the end of the first part of American Gods. And we're going to look back at the novel so far. We're going to look back at the journey that Shadow has undertaken. We're going to look back at the changes, if any, which he has endured. And we're going to ask how Shadow's world is different now than it was before. And in that context, what purpose the 8th chapter of American Gods actually serves. So there's a great deal to discuss. I have, of course, just a ton of slides. This is, gosh, this is probably my favorite chapter so far. It's not my favorite chapter in the entire book, but it is awfully close. I love this chapter, and primarily I love this chapter because I love Mr. Ibis. Mr. Ibis is extremely good. We'll talk a lot about him as we get there. Yes. Good. Everything is working. Everyone is here. I'm so glad to have you all here. Yes, we had a brief technical interruption before the podcast started, which the live audience was privy to. And as Princess Ostrich points out here in the YouTube chat, that was Technical Boy. Could have been Technical Boy. Could have been Technical Boy. Could have been Media. I feel like I'm under the sway of 2 of the new gods here, which is not a great place to be. 2 at least. Aaron says, let's skip the Will and Grace reboot and just make an Ibis and Jackal 3-camera sitcom. I would love that very much. In fact, that would be very good. And I guess Matt Sweeney can just be the neighbor who drops in. He can be the, I don't know, Steve Urkel for this particular sitcom scenario. I guess not so much by the end of this chapter, but we'll circle back around to that anyway. All right, let's get to the beginning, because as I said, we're going to pick up in chapter 7 with our Somewhere in America, and we're going to begin with Salim. Salim got there at 10:30 a.m., half an hour before his appointment. Now he sits there, flushed and shivering, wondering if he's running a fever. The time ticks by so slowly. Salim looks at his watch. Then he clears his throat. The woman behind the desk glares at him. Yes, she says. It sounds like yet. It's 11:35, says Salim. The woman glances at the clock on the wall and says, Yet, again. It is. My appointment was for 11, says Salim with a placating smile. Mr. Blanding knows you're here, she tells him reprovingly. Mr. Blanding, don't you're here. This is an introduction, a powerful, an immediate, an arresting, a beguiling in its way, and also oppressive introduction to what is, I think, for many people, their favorite of the vignettes that we get through the course of the book. This is more true now, perhaps, than ever, given the emphasis that the TV show put on this particular vignette, and the faithfulness with which this vignette was replicated in the Starz adaptation. They did a beautiful job of adapting pretty much every incidental detail of this brief story that we get here. They spent a long and loving time depicting this scene, and it really worked. But there's a lot going on beneath the surface of the prose that isn't, I think, readily apparent just in the movement of the story. When the story is adapted for the screen, it becomes shocking and luminous and beautiful and oddly transgressive, because in some ways TV, even in 2017, is still pretty reactionary. And this depiction of a moment of intimacy between two people, a moment of powerful and life-changing intimacy between two people, was still somewhat provocative. And perhaps it ought not to be provocative, but it is. But in the representation, in the literalization of the text, there are some elements which are lost. That, of course, is inevitable. That's the strength of the medium. Television is a visual medium, so you get to show lavishly and indulgently and opulently, and that is exactly what the sequence did. But there are some complexities here that are underrepresented, if not outright omitted, from the adaptation. And one of these, I think, can be found here in the opening movement of Salim's story. In the TV show, this is a surrealist, Frostian kind of, there's something very, very strange about this. It doesn't feel quite like the real world. Here, though, in the prose of the novel, we are not allowed to escape from the real world. Look there at that first paragraph. Salim got there at 10:30 a.m., half an hour before his appointment. Now he sits there. That period in the middle of that sentence breaks our POV. It breaks our perspective on the scene. We were in the past tense. We were in traditional third-person past tense storytelling. Salim got there at 10:30 a.m. But now we break hard into the present tense, and present tense gives us an emotional immediacy which is impossible to shake. We feel powerfully what Salim is feeling throughout this entire exchange, throughout this entire sequence, because we are right there with him. We're not allowed the luxury of temporal removal. That's all the more powerful as we get into the, well, I guess, joke of the receptionist's cold. And it reads as a joke. Yet, she says, it is. It reads as though this is just an absurdist reference toward, I don't know, corporate America, toward the mundanity of the workplace, toward, minor inconvenience and the minor trials that we overcome on a daily basis. But it is, I think, something much more important than that. I think that what is happening here is that Salim is being alienated from language here. The obscurity of the receptionist's language, because she is under the influence of a cold, makes it all the more difficult for Salim to communicate, and thus all the more difficult for Salim to form a connection. And Salim is a man who forms connections, not least of all, of course, because he's a salesman. And every act of selling involves the creation of a relationship. You have to forge this relationship, then leverage this relationship in order to make the sale. So Salim is doing his best here, but he is cut off from this woman because of this almost this language barrier. He is unable to communicate clearly with her, or she is unable to communicate clearly with him. There is an obstruction there between the two of them, an obstruction to the flow of communication between the two of them. And that speaks to Salim's outright alienation. Here he is cut off again and again and again. And as we get the accounts, of course, of his family, as we get the accounts of his experiences, we get him doubting his presence here. We're seeing that disconnection and that obstruction manifest itself in a number of different ways. And what the Ifrit does ultimately, I guess we can talk about this in a couple of slides' time, but ultimately what the Ifrit does is reset his potential for connection. He is now no longer burdened with this this accumulated detritus. You know, he doesn't have to worry about all of the things that were blocking him, that were containing him, that were constraining him before he gets, I mean, the nominal fresh start, at least, right? He gets the opportunity again to begin to create new relationships, to create new connections, and to move forward. That is enormously powerful. Let me see here. Leslie Skipa here in the chat says, native of NYC, it's its own world with its own currency, energy, its own concept of time, and its own way of being. Certainly, I think that is true, and we get a sense that New York City is not interchangeable with other places within the frame of this narrative, though it is also fair to say, I think, that in some sense, New York is the encapsulation of a certain perspective on America. It is the distillation of America. Again, not definitively, but in a very narrow way. There is a kind of America that is represented in the streets of New York within the frame of this vignette. Yes. Yes, good. Sarah says, anyone who has ever tried to do this kind of work knows the humiliating feeling. Yes, certainly. And Jean says, using setting as a character is a huge technique Gaiman uses in the novel. I love how juxtaposed we are between sections set in cities and those set in rural areas. And two, how fully those settings are anchored in character and characters are anchored in settings. These characters can only, to a certain degree, exist where they exist. It is almost tautologically true that the Zorayas and Chernobog are in Chicago. That is their place. They are, in a sense, of that place. That is the Russian immigrant tradition. It is interesting that Salim and the Ifrit are in New York. They are of that place. They are bound by their story, and their story has defined their circumstance, has defined their setting. That's true, as I said, of Chicago, of New York. It's true, certainly, of Cairo and of Egypt, which we'll talk about specifically, explicitly later in today's session. But it's also true, in an interesting way, of Eagle Point, of the time that Shadow spent in prison. We are the products of our circumstance, the products of our geography, if you like, but we also imprint our geography with our sense of ourselves. So there is a reactive, kind of reflexive connection between these two things. And I'm fascinated by the degree to which we seem to be, human beings seem to be, within the frame of American gods, drawn to those gods which speak most eloquently, most directly, most truly to us. I find that fascinating. I find it's Salim does not stumble upon, you know, a god of another pantheon. He doesn't stumble upon, I don't know, Thor just hanging out driving a cab in New York. So presumably Thor wouldn't be doing that. I guess belief in Thor is probably pretty good following the Avengers movies. Though, of course, we don't know for sure that those exist in the world of American gods. So he doesn't encounter a god of another pantheon. He doesn't encounter a supernatural being codified by a different, you know, religious, a different theological, a different philosophical, a different metaphysical tradition. He encounters a being that is of his immediate culture. They have connection. They have this deep compatibility almost. And I'm very curious about what we're to make of that. And we'll certainly have the opportunity to talk about that as we I guess, move into next week's reading and we move into part 2 of the book. Good. Excellent. All right. Let's, as Becca Eller says, Salim wins. His wish comes true and he gets to start a new free life in America, even if it's not fancy. Jin is amazing and I love him. I think we all feel very good for Salim at the end of this, unless you are, you know, open to the idea that Salim is not who he seems to be at the end of this, which I'm not so much, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Here is our second slide. Salim puts out a hand, pats the Ifrit's shoulder. He can feel solid flash through the wool of the sweater. The Ifrit raises his hand from the wheel, rests it on Salim's hand for a moment. Salim thinks of the desert then. Red sands blow a dust storm through his thoughts, and the scarlet silks of the tents that surrounded the lost city of Ubar flap and billow through his mind. They drive up 8th Avenue. The old believe. They do not piss into holes because the prophet told them that the jinn live in holes. They know that the angels throw flaming stars at us when we try to listen to their conversations, but even for the old, when they came to this country, we were very, very far away. Back then, I did not have to drive a cab. I'm sorry, says Salim. It is a bad time, says the driver. A storm is coming. It scares me. I would do anything to get away. Obviously, I want to talk about that last line because that last line is the line that kind of breaks the vignetting of this short scene. It breaks the frame of this tiny encapsulated story and speaks to the larger themes of the novel. I mean, in ways other than the presence of gods and the power of belief and so on and so forth. That is the direct reference to the plot of the rest of the novel, I suppose I should say. But what I want to talk about really here is Gaiman's mastery of the present tense. We are so close to Salim. This is one of the reasons that this section has the emotional power that it has. We are unable to remove ourselves from Salim. If you think about moments of great emotional intimacy that we've seen in the novel so far. Think right back to the first chapter, for example, where we get these moments of emotional intimacy from Shadow, but the emotional intimacy is basically the absence of emotional intimacy. We are given a space which we can fill with whatever we imagine, and Shadow said nothing. We don't get that from Salim. We get this very personal, very, very intimate connection with Salim, which allows Gaiman to not write expansively, but to write with enormous precision. That second paragraph. Salim thinks of the desert then. Red sands blow a dust storm through his thoughts, and the scarlet silks of the tents that surrounded the lost city of Ubar flap and billow through his mind. This is the evocation of memory. This is the evocation fundamentally of identity, it might be argued. This is a moment of transportation that is nonetheless true. Then we transition to reality. We were dropped back in exactly the same way as we often are with Shadow. We've seen this before, right? Where we become expansive, we become grandiloquent in our description, and then we collapse back into the brutal mundanity of Shadow's experience. This is what happens here, but it happens in a very different way because we are so connected, to Salim. So we get this powerful metaphor, this dust storm, the scarlet silks, everything is moving. He's suddenly transported. He's suddenly reconnected. He has this thing that he has been searching for. They drive up 8th Avenue. As mundane and prosaic an experience as you can possibly imagine. So again, what we're seeing here is Gaiman's mastery of the form, but we're also being pulled into the immediacy of Salim's experience, which only grows more and more intimate as we move through the actual sex, as we move through the encounter that they share, this moment of profound intimacy, and then the inversion of that, and almost in a sense the restoration of that, because as we move toward the culmination of this sequence, Salim's account becomes fragmented itself. He doesn't remember how we get from one beat to the next beat. He's suddenly crying, and the Ifrit is kissing away his tears, and with the heat of his body, drying them. It's this enormously powerful, and again enormously intimate, but also kind of emotionally blurred space. So that when we return once again to mundanity, well, when Salim wakes, the cold sun creeping into the white room, he is alone. Also, he discovers his sample case is gone. All the bottles and rings and souvenir copper flashlights, all gone, along with his suitcase, his wallet, his passport, and his air tickets back to Oman. He finds a pair of jeans, the t-shirt, and the dust-covered woolen sweater discarded on the floor. Beneath them, he finds a driver's license with the name of Ibrahim bin Iram, a taxi permit in the same name, and a ring of keys with an address written on a piece of paper attached to them in English. The photographs on the license and the permit ID do not look much like Salim, look much like the Ifrit. The telephone rings. It is the front desk calling to point out that Salim has already checked out, and his guest needs to leave soon so they can service the room to get it ready for another occupant. I do not grant wishes, says Salim, tasting the way the words shape themselves in his mouth. He feels strangely lightheaded as he dresses. New York is very simple. The avenues run north to south, the streets run west to east. How hard can it be, he asks himself. He tosses the car keys into the air and catches them. Then he puts on the black plastic sunglasses he found in the pockets and leaves the hotel room to go and look for his cab. This is enormously profound, not least of all because, well, throughout this vignette in particular, but ultimately throughout the entire book, we have been talking about identity. Gods are beings, supernatural entities are beings which are defined by nothing more than identity. They are themselves because they are believed to be themselves. And if, as we'll explore in the next few pages, something should shift within that understanding, then the gods themselves are malleable. Perhaps not immediately, but ultimately. Here we see an entirely different perspective on identity. The Ifrit has, in a sense, switched, has subsumed, has surrendered identity here. The Ifrit has given Salim his new life at the cost of his own, in a sense, though even then, this ending is ambiguous enough that we can't be certain exactly how the mechanics of the Ifrit's quote-unquote wish work. Do we believe that the Ifrit can actually grant wishes? Well, no. I think everything within the text encourages us to see this, if we see it at all, as any kind of transaction, as any kind of voluntary arrangement. If the Ifrit here is not simply fulfilling his purpose, if this is not a function of Salim's belief and belief in general, if the Ifrit is making a conscious choice here to connect with Salim, to grant his wish, lowercase g, lowercase w, I suppose, then we're seeing something that is an act of enormous generosity, an enormous, a kind of shared humanity, I suppose. This recognition, this condescension, this kindness. This is enormously powerful, regardless, I think, of how you read it, wherever you put it on the magical scale, however supernatural it is. And certainly there is an account here that there is a perspective on this that suggests that it need not be supernatural at all. And that is damning in and of itself, because if this entire thing has happened not because the Ifrit has any kind of magical powers, not because the Ifrit had any kind of insight into Salim's situations of orchestrating this new life, this transformation, if this is as mundane as the transaction of ID and license, if this is simply the case that Salim can take over this new life because the lives of men like Salim are fungible, they are interchangeable here in the United States, here in New York, particularly for taxi drivers, then that is, wow, that is grim. That is difficult. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the text leaves that space open for us, that we can't entirely definitively close it down. And we get this from Salim. I do not grant wishes, he says, tasting the way the words shape themselves in his mouth. What are we to make of that? The ambiguity of this is completely unavoidable. We have to acknowledge that that Salim has had a supernatural encounter, but also potentially a completely natural encounter. That the transformation that he has experienced, the change in his fortunes, the change in his life, the granting of his wish may have nothing to do with the fact that the Ifrit is an Ifrit. I find that relentlessly fascinating. And of course, this is another perspective on the interactions, the specific and physical interactions between human beings and supernatural entities and American gods, which will, of course, become urgently significant in the next chapters. So let me catch up here with the YouTube chat. Yes, surrendered identity, Angela says. Wonderfully said. Good. I'm glad that I'm not sure that I was communicating that properly. I'm glad that works. Okay, good. Oh, we're talking about live tweets. That's excellent. Yes, and of course, it is true, as is observed here, that that a lot of cab drivers don't look a lot like their licenses. Yes, that's fair. All right. Sarah Thomas says this is almost Jungian. Salim is having a shared cultural memory. I wonder if that's the dust storm that you're referring to there, Sarah. That's fascinating. I think that yes, I think that that may be a way of reading it, and certainly the notion of, okay, I wasn't expecting to take this tangent, but I rather like it. The notion of a shared subconscious, of a culturally endemic shared subconscious, is a fascinating one within the world of American gods, because the gods themselves don't seem to rely on acts of individual belief as much as they rely on accumulations of belief. They rely on belief in the aggregate rather than in the singular. And that is fascinating because of that reflexive relationship. I was talking before about the ways in which we are transformed by our locations, but we also transform our locations by our presence. And this is a reciprocal relationship. Well, I think the same is true of the gods. We create the gods through our belief, but of course, by believing in them, we are in some sense defined. If in no other way, we are defined as people who believe in this God. Thus, we are transformed by the existence of the God that we ourselves created, and so on and so on and so forth. But that doesn't seem to be, as I said, singular. It does seem to have, it's almost as though there is a pool of belief that is itself reciprocal. So we can draw upon these shared myths and these shared stories. We can pull upon the ways in which these stories have transformed our culture. So you don't necessarily need to invoke a Jungian model. I think you don't necessarily need to invoke a magic shared subconscious. It is possible to see the magic shared subconscious here as cultural artifact, as the stories that we tell each other, the images that we have, the metaphors that we use, the idioms upon which we rely, the language itself can carry the weight of that shared subconscious, if you like. So I'm fascinated by that. I like that idea very much. We can continue to look at the ways in which we are shaped by gods, even as we shape gods ourselves. Aaron asks, so if a god or a freak leaves America, do they merge back to the version of themselves in the place that they go to? Your guess is as good as mine. Aaron, your guess is as good as mine. This is a very challenging question. And it's almost a challenging question, I think, that it's a question which, if we take it very seriously, can threaten to break the frame of the narrative, because we're not talking about gods in general, we're talking about American gods. And I mentioned, I think it was last time or possibly even the previous session, that for the purposes of this story, America is everything. That the entire world is present here, that the entire world is reflected within the bounds of the United States, that we don't need to go beyond, because metaphorically speaking, the United States is the world. So everyone comes here, but if we look at that through the lens, in fact, we'll get a chance to talk about this a little later, but if we look at the coming to America as less of a geographical transition and more of a existential transition, then I think we get a cleaner sense of what it is that Gaiman, what Gaiman intends here. He is rendering American culture monolithic. The perspectives that we get on on other cultures are always from the point of view of comparison. We are looking at a fragment of another culture as a lens through which we can see American culture differently, and that, I think, is enormously powerful. So, yeah, as far as we're concerned, America is the world within the frame of this book, and certainly we're going to push that. I haven't mentioned it in a while, but right at the end of this seminar, we're actually going to look at the 2 short stories which have been written describing, well, I don't want to say what they describe, actually, because that's pretty significant spoilers for the end of the book, I suppose. There are 2 short stories which aren't set in America, but are set in the world of American gods, and we will have the opportunity to talk about those right at the end of the run. That's Monarch of the Glen and Black Dog. I'm looking forward to reading those with you all. I think we're going to do them all in the same session. Yes, it's going to be very, very good. Okay, so let me see here. So Leslie Skiba asks, so do we see the sex as an act of worship of the Ifrit by Salim, which then grants him a wish in a sense? This is exactly the question, Skiba. Is this transactive in, I guess, kind of the opposite way to Bilquis in the first chapter? Is this an act of worship that empowers the jinn, that empowers the Ifrit, and allows him to take action? Possibly. Another alternative perspective would be that this is simply a moment of strictly human connection, that 2 incarnated beings find a moment of intimacy, and that there is nothing magical about this transaction. And that's fascinating. I want to kind of keep that idea just on a low boil at the back of our mental stoves here. I just want to keep this idea warm for later. The idea that through kindness and generosity, and actually strip that of any kind of qualitative judgment, through interaction and connection with others, we are all capable of expressing something approaching magic. I'm hesitating here because I don't want to be too definitive in my use of language, but we are capable of expressing something powerful, the kind of virtues that we would usually associate with gods, the kind of indulgences and grace that we would normally associate with gods. So let's keep that on the back burner. I absolutely have to push on now, because we're half an hour in and we've got lots to cover. Lauren is taking off. Thank you so much for hanging out, Lauren. All right. And Skipa also says, since Salim believes the Ifrit comes to those who are to die, then his taking on a new identity fulfills that death quotient. Possibly, yes. That's a nice bit of interpretation. Yes, good. All right, let's push on, because we have to actually begin talking about chapter 8. We've got a few slides to get through, and we'll begin with our introduction here. Ibis and Jekyll, and excuse me, here's the problem. I'm going to apologize for this right up front. When I read this book, in order to differentiate Jekyll from Jackal, I pronounce it Jekyll with the emphasis on the last syllable there. So I'm going to do that accidentally as I'm reading these slides. I apologize. I think it should be pronounced Jackal. I don't necessarily think that we need to stress this. I'm good with that, but I will slip up because this is a word that I read and decided my own pronunciation for. So here we go. Ibis and Jekyll was a small family-owned funeral home, one of the last truly independent funeral homes in the area, or so Mr. Ibis maintained. Most fields of human merchandising value nationwide brand identities, he said. Mr. Ibis spoke in explanations, a gentle, earnest lecturing that put Shadow in mind of a college professor who used to work out at the mussel farm and who could not talk, could only discourse, expound, explain. Shadow had figured out within the first few minutes of meeting Mr. Ibis that his expected part in any conversation with the funeral director was to say as little as possible. They were sitting in a small restaurant 2 blocks from Ibis and Jackal's funeral home. Shadow's supper consisted of an all-day full breakfast. It came with hush puppies, while Mr. Ibis picked and pecked at a slice of coffee cake. This, I believe, is because people like to know what they're getting ahead of time. Thus, McDonald's, Walmart, F.W. Woolworth of blessed memory. Store brands maintained and visible across the entire country. Wherever you go, you will get something that is, with small regional variations, the same. In the field of funeral homes, however, things are perforce different. You need to feel you are getting small-town personal service from someone who has a calling to the profession. You want personal attention to you and your loved one in a time of great loss. You wish to know that your grief is happening on a local level, not on a national one. But in all branches of industry, and death is an industry, my young friend, make no mistake about that, one makes one's money from operating in bulk, from buying in quantity, from centralizing one's operations. It's not pretty, but it's true. Trouble is, no one wants to know that their loved ones are traveling in a cooler van to some big old converted warehouse where they have 20, 50, 100 cadavers on the go. No, sir. Folks want to think they're going to a family concern, somewhere they'll be treated with respect by someone who'll tip his hat to them if he sees them in the street. Mr. Ibis wore a hat. It was a sober brown hat that matched his sober brown blazer and his sober brown face. Small gold-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. In Shadow's memory, Mr. Ibis was a short man. Whenever he would stand beside him, Shadow would rediscover that Mr. Ibis was well over 6 feet in height, with a crane-like stoop. Ibis is absolutely my favorite character. Ibis is an extraordinary character. I could pretty much just read Ibis's dialogue forever, just forever. That would be wonderful. It's beautifully written. It's absolutely true, and it's just so full, so reflective of exactly the kind of sense of America. It is replete with the same sense of America as some of Wednesday's dialogue has been, some of Chernobog's dialogue has been, some of Mr. Nancy's dialogue has been, and yet he takes it that step further. Of course, we should remember that that Ibis is, I could just jump the conclusion here, I think, because anyone who has any sense of Egyptian mythology can get there already on their own, that Ibis is, well, Thoth, however you choose to pronounce that deity's name. He is the god of knowledge and of the moon and of measurement and of wisdom and of the alphabet and of records and thought and intelligence and meditation and the mind and logic and reason and reading and hieroglyphics and magic and secrets and scribes and writing. And that is the crucial one, that within the bounds of the Egyptian pantheon, Thoth is the god of writing. He created the concept of writing. So of course, Mr. Ibis writes and does so beautifully. Excellent. I love Ibis, says Jean. I think, yeah, we're all pretty good. Yeah, and Julie Patchouli here says, the quirks of Shadow's memory are so interesting. Yes, and I wanted to call this out because I found this fascinating too. In Shadow's memory, Mr. Ibis was a short man. Whenever he would stand beside him, Shadow would rediscover that Mr. Ibis was well over 6 feet in height with a crane-like stoop. What is the functional interplay there between Shadow's experience and Shadow's memory? Where is this memory coming from? Why is Shadow's memory inaccurate? We don't have a general sense that Shadow has trouble remembering things. Shadow, in fact, seems to pay pretty close attention to the details of the world around him. I'm fascinated by this exchange, primarily fascinated, of course, because memory is a function of narrative, and narrative is the mechanism by which we believe in things. Thus, we were talking about this pool of Jungian subconsciousness. You know, I wonder to what degree Shadow's memory of Mr. Ibis is in some sense reflective of the story of Mr. Ibis rather than the actuality of Ibis, that Shadow's experience is being overwritten by this shared memory, that his experience is being challenged and overwritten by the story itself. Possibly. Most importantly, throughout this account, though, we're given this sense of American economics, I suppose, and not simply American economics. The rules of economics, as Mr. Ibis lays them out, are going to be true pretty much anywhere if you subscribe to this kind of perspective. But this is a quintessentially American take on these kinds of business dealings. The notion of sometimes we seek comfort in homogeneity. You know, sometimes we want that thing to be the same as it would be in any other part of the country. And sometimes we want that specialized dedicated service, but there is a fundamental hypocrisy there, that we're selling personal service through the means that we communicate this kind of cultural homogeneity. That I think is interesting and speaks, of course, as I said earlier, to conversations we've had earlier in the novel. Yes, let me see here. Princess Ostrich says, as Neil Gaiman doesn't have his mind set to make it so, the allusions to the gods aren't terribly subtle. Yes, though that's almost purposeful, I think, at this point. I think that he can be spectacularly oblique. Here, he's not oblique, but we also don't rely upon any kind of obliquity. We're willing to be somewhat upfront about the identity of these gods, and Shadow himself is on board. We're not even playing this for any kind of dramatic irony. There's no real separation between the reader and Shadow at this point. So I'm somewhat comfortable at this point in the novel with simply accepting the identities here and pushing onward with them. It works for me, yeah. Let me see here. As Jean says, I feel like for the most part, the references are meant to be fairly opaque. To me, it speaks how the old gods are being forgotten despite how obvious their presence should be. That's very good. Yes. As Kate Metz says, Toth is the uber Ravenclaw. I'm into that. There must be, I knew there was a reason why I liked him as much as I do, and that must be it. As a Ravenclaw myself, I'm sure that we have a lot in common. Yes, good. All right. But then we get, oh gosh, what maybe one of my favorite passages in the book. I adore this conversation because we start talking about how it is that Ibis and Jekyll came to America, and the fact that our story of this country is perhaps more limited than we expect it to be. Columbus did what people have been doing for thousands of years. There's nothing special about coming to America. I've been writing stories about it from time to time. They began to walk again. True stories? Up to a point, yes. I'll let you read one or two if you like. It's all there for anyone who has eyes to see it. Personally, and this is speaking as a subscriber to Scientific American here, I feel very sorry for the professionals whenever they find another confusing skull, something that belonged to the wrong sort of people, or whenever they find statues or artifacts that confuse them. For they'll talk about the odd, but they won't talk about the impossible, which is where I feel sorry for them. For as soon as something becomes impossible, it slides out of belief entirely, whether it's true or not. I mean, here's a skull that shows the Ainu, the Japanese Aboriginal race, were in America 9,000 years ago. Here's another that shows there were Polynesians in California nearly 2,000 years later. And all the scientists mutter and puzzle over who's descended from whom, missing the point entirely. Heaven knows what'll happen if they actually find the Hopi emergence tunnels. That'll shake a few things up. Just you wait. Did the Irish come to America in the Dark Ages, you ask me? Of course they did. And the Welsh and the Vikings, while the Africans from the West Coast, what in later days they called the Slave Coast or the Ivory Coast, they were trading with South America. And the Chinese visited Oregon a couple of times. They called it Fusang. The Basque established their secret sacred fishing grounds off the coast of Newfoundland 1,200 years back. Now, I suppose you're going to say, but Mr. Ibis, these people were primitives. They didn't have radio controls and vitamin pills and jet airplanes. Another minor detail here in Ibis's explanation, that last line. Now, I suppose you're going to say, but Mr. Ibis, these people were primitives. They didn't have radio controls and vitamin pills and jet airplanes. Once again, we find a god whose frame of reference is out of date. We find a god whose frame of reference is at least a couple of decades out of date. Radio controls and vitamin pills and jet airplanes? Ibis sounds as though he's describing the 1960s, but he's not. He's speaking to the modern world. And we know for sure that the internet exists. We know for sure that technology has marched on apace, but Ibis is left behind. Now, this may simply be true of his character, that he doesn't keep up with the march of technology, that he is happier with a pen and a piece of paper than he is with the latest computer technology. But it may also be indicative of a phenomenon that we've observed before. It may speak to this same notion that the technical boy and media are also behind the times. We have the sense here that gods, because they are informed by belief, are always lagging behind the movement of society and culture. They're, if you like, host cultures. Most importantly, though, we get the sense that coming to America is what people do, that people have been doing it for the longest possible time. And we'll get a beat in just a moment where Becca Eller asks in the YouTube chat, hey guys, is Ibis a wonk? No wonder I love him. Yes, yes, Ibis is a god wonk, says Kate Met. That's lovely. And Princess Ostrich says, Ibis is basically Giles, which I'm into as well. Yes, yes, I'm very into that. That's good. So we're going to get this beat that suggests that the reason people come to America and don't linger is simply that there was no one here to trade with and it was too far away, that it was a crossroads of sorts, but it was never going to be a cradle of civilization, that it was never going to be a home. It was only ever going to be the place that you go to across the sea. Except, of course, America happened. The United States happened. The conquest of the New World happened. And this, of course, is to skate over completely the existence of native cultures, indigenous cultures, which we will address, I'm glad to say, more directly as we move into part 2 of the book. So what is it that makes America special? People have been coming here for 10,000 years. What is it that makes the culture of the United States? What is it that makes here and now special? What is this quintessential identity that unifies these people? What is it that makes America America? And what is it that makes the gods of America different? What is it that makes them who they are? Well, let's continue to pay attention to that as we move forward. Yes. Good. Good. Excellent. All right. Let's keep moving forward as we return, in fact, to the funeral home, and we find Jekyll performing the autopsy of the young girl who has been brutally stabbed by her boyfriend. Jekyll continued to talk to the microphone, describing what he was doing, what he saw as he removed the girl's liver, the stomach, spleen, pancreas, both kidneys, the uterus, and the ovaries. He weighed each organ, reported them as normal and uninjured. From each organ, he took a small slice and put it in a jar of formaldehyde. From the heart, the liver, and from one of the kidneys, he cut an additional slice. These pieces he chewed slowly, making them last, and ate while he worked. Somehow it seemed to shadow a good thing for him to do, respectful, not obscene. So you want to stay with us for a spell, said Jackal, masticating the slice of the girl's heart. If you'll have me, said Shadow. Certainly we'll have you, said Mr. Ibis. No reasons why not, and plenty of reasons why. You'll be under our protection as long as you're here. This is gorgeous. The respectfulness, the intimacy, the truth. This is Anubis. Obviously, Jackal is Anubis. This is Anubis fulfilling his function. This is Anubis being what he is and doing so with, as Shadow says, with respect, rather than any kind of predatory sense of obscenity. It feels true. Sarah Thomas is asking here in the YouTube chat, is it special? Is the book making that argument? I'm not sure that it is. This is referring to America. What is it about America? And Wildfire says, yeah, it almost feels like the US has just sort of fallen together randomly. Here's the thing about that argument. Falling together randomly does not exclude the possibility that America is special. What makes America special, and I want to kind of hedge this a little carefully, but what makes America special, it seems to me within the pages of the novel, is the fact that America believes itself to be special. It is the story. It is from this foundational idea and this foundational mythology all the way through to the present day. The the narrative that has built up around the United States seems to me that thing which separates the United States from all other countries. That is not to suggest that other countries don't have stories, that they don't have narratives. You know, I'm sure that people who live in Portugal and Estonia believe that Portugal and Estonia are the best countries in the world, but they don't necessarily believe that they are special in the same sense. And partly this is because the United States is a fabricated nation. It is a constructed nation. It is, as I've said before, a nation founded upon an idea. Now, that is a simplified version of that narrative. That is a story about a story. That is myth-making right there. But that doesn't mean that it isn't emotionally true. So I think that what Gaiman is indicating here is that America in its effervescent diaspora, that America in its breadth and its width and its depth, and also oddly in its homogeneous superficiality, is a place that tells a story about itself, is a place that tells a story of specialness, is a place that tells a story of uniquity about itself, and that itself, that storytelling, that myth making, is what separates it from the rest of the world. That obviously is not a completely that is not an uncritical perspective on America, but it is also not an unaffectionate perspective on America. I think that it is possible to see the good in that, and to see the virtue in that, and also to see the slight absurdity in that, and also to see the kind of the somewhat narcissistic, I think is too heavy-handed, but certainly the vanity in that. Yes. As Sarah says, I think the book is making the argument that the US is artificial. At least I believe that's one aspect. I completely believe that's true. Yes, that the United States is a constructed thing that is of crucial importance. We are almost never allowed to relax into anything that is organic within the bounds of American gods, within the bounds of the United States in this sense. Artificiality and construction are ways of life, from the roadside attractions to the ways in which we interact with our sense of community, you know, the ways in which we're allowed to rest and to settle in moments of respite, as we're getting in this chapter, for example, as we got to a certain extent in Eagle Point, as we will get to a certain extent in the second part of the book, which will begin next week. These moments of respite and peace are also themselves artificial. They're also themselves constructed. The gods and the foundations of our culture and the foundations of our social infrastructure are all constructed. And that, I think, is something that genuinely makes the United States unique. Yeah. Good. Okay. Let me see here. Kate says, the story of America is the empty glass filled with other cultures, but the truth of America is one of erasure and forgetting the past to make a better future. That's interesting. Again, we'll have the opportunity to talk about that as we pull that out later. Yes, good. Skiba is using hashtag Hamelgods, which is, I mean, just an awesome thing, and quotes Burr, we studied and we fought and we killed for the notion of a nation we now get to build. That is exactly right. It was I suppose that perhaps is how I would differentiate the building of the United States from the building of other constructed states. That oftentimes construction happens through a kind of necessity, but in the United States and in the history of America, it was always a conscious act of creation. And I think that is a significant point of differentiation. Yeah, good. Great. All right, let's keep going on. Yes, I was talking about Anubis, and I was talking about the respect that he shows as he consumes delicately the slivers of this young woman's internal organs, and the sense in which that is. And we are reminded, as we are reminded surprisingly infrequently through the pages of American Gods, that the gods were called upon oftentimes to create, to serve our cultures, to serve our sense of innate justice. That our relationship with the gods is not always straightforward, but is usually benevolent, and we usually entrust our gods, depending on the pantheon in question, of course, with a kind of wisdom and sober judgment, which we haven't seen a great deal of lately. Anubis Ibis and Jackal are very different kinds of gods, and it is no coincidence, I think, that they are older. Yeah. Good. Okay. Let's push on. After this, Shadow says that he's going to help them in any way that he can, that he will earn his keep, that he will work for the funeral parlor while he is there. He is sent off to go and bathe and to clean himself up, and he shaves with a straight razor, only to have an odd encounter. And then, as if someone else were holding his hand, he raised the straight razor, placed it, blade open, against his throat. It would be a way out, he thought, an easy way out. And if there's anyone who'd simply take it in their stride, who just clean up the mess and get on with things, it's the two guys sitting downstairs at the kitchen table drinking their beer. No more worries. No more Laura. No more mysteries and conspiracies. No more bad dreams. Just peace and quiet and rest forever. One clean slash, ear to ear. That's all it'll take. He stood there with the razor against his throat. A tiny smudge of blood came from the place where the blade touched the skin. He had not even noticed a cut. See? He told himself, and he could almost hear the words being whispered in his ear. It's painless, too sharp to hurt. I'll be gone before I know it. Then the door to the bathroom swung open just a few inches, enough for the little brown cat to put her head around the doorframe and murr up at him curiously. Hey, he said to the cat, I thought I locked that door. He closed the cutthroat razor, put it down on the side of the sink, dabbed at the tiny cut with a toilet paper swab. Then he wrapped a towel around his waist and went into the bedroom next door. Here we have the introduction of Bast. Here we have the introduction of Bastet, who we'll return to in just a few minutes because she's going to play a much larger part in the unfolding narrative through this chapter. First, though, we have to talk about this odd moment that Shadow has, and we have to talk about what is going on here. And I have to admit, there are moments of synchronicity between the books that I cover here at Point North Media. I'm covering right now a number of titles. Obviously, I'm doing one-shot seminars about other books and other movies, and that's always fun. But the two big series that I'm doing right now are Storms on the Way, dedicated to American Gods, and There and Back Again, which is dedicated to the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And this, to me, feels like the presence of the Ring. Something here is whispering to Shadow. Something here is urging him, pushing him onward, is making him question. Something here is leading Shadow down a dark, dark path. And I'm not sure what exactly we're supposed to make of this right now, except, of course, though, as Sarah points out, yes, there are similarities between American Gods and The Lord of the Rings. There is no cat sex in The Lord of the Rings. That's true. That's a very fair point. Yes. Good. Yes. So Shadow has this moment of doubt, and he is either talking himself or is being talked into the worst kind of the worst kind of impulse that he could possibly experience in this moment. And I wonder what we're supposed to make of that. I wonder what you all make of that. Is this simply fatigue? Because I do think that there's an interesting arc through this part of the book that speaks to Shadow's restoration, that speaks to his renewal, that speaks to his healing, that speaks, of course, to his protection, because Bast ultimately is the goddess of protection. Here she is watching out for him. She's going to watch out for him in a less literal way, but in a more perhaps complete way in a few pages to come, or at least that's one interpretation. And as Jonathan's calling out here in the YouTube chat, this is a pretty close interpretation of Bast from his Sandman stories for DC. Yes, it is. Bast is almost a recurring character. I have seen some hints that in the same way as Mr. Nancy pops up in another story, which I suppose that's not even a spoiler really to talk about it, but nonetheless, there is some crossover here between Gaiman's other work, his comics work for Sandman in particular, and American Gods. And certainly Bast feels very, very familiar. Yes. Good. Another moon goddess to look out for him, says Jonathan. Yes, of course, good. Though Thoth too is of the moon. He is also associated with the moon, which is interesting since we're going to be talking about the sun coin in just a few minutes. Yeah. Okay, good. Yes, just a little window into Gaiman's mind, says Sarah Thomas. Yes, absolutely. Excellent. Okay, so let's I just realized that I left that slide up. Let's move on to the next one because we still have a lot to cover here. as we move ahead in time here. Yes, good. Good. So Shadow and Jackal go to Lila Goodchild. We have a brief beat about her upset husband and about his future. Oh, we also here get a brief glimpse of Media on the TV screen, to whom Shadow raises an unobserved middle digit. And then we have this exchange. Shadow thought, "Hey, Jackal? Yeah. Do you believe in the soul?" It wasn't quite the question he had been going to ask, and it took him by surprise to hear it coming from his mouth. He had intended to say something less direct, but there was nothing less direct that he could say. Depends. Back in my day, we had it all set up. You line up when you die, and you answer for your evil deeds and for your good deeds, and if your evil weeds outweighed a feather, we'd feed your soul and your heart to Ammit, the eater of souls. He must have eaten a lot of people. Not as many as you'd think. It was a really heavy feather. We had it made special. You had to be pretty damn evil to tip the scales on that baby. Stop here at gas station. We'll put in a few gallons. This is one of my favorite jokes in the entire book, but it's not just a joke. It's not just a throwaway gag here. It was a really heavy feather. We had it made special. This is one of those moments when you can hear Douglas Adams under Neil Gaiman's writing, when you can hear Terry Pratchett under Neil Gaiman's writing, even P.G. Wodehouse under Neil Gaiman's writing. These are obvious and powerful influences on Gaiman's work, but as ever, Gaiman manages to take it that one step further, because we have to ask what this means. What is Anubis saying here? What is Jackal telling us here about the expectations associated with the rituals of death? He must have eaten a lot of people, says Shadow. Not as many as you'd think, comes the response. It was a really heavy feather. We had it made special. You had to be pretty damn evil to tip the scales on that baby. So the first interpretation might be, that's funny. That's a good gag. The second interpretation, if we circle back to it, might be, okay, so perhaps what we're seeing here is a kind of generosity from the gods associated with death in ancient Egypt, that maybe we'll lean into the idea that they are benevolent and merciful beyond their expected roles. That, hey, Anubis isn't such a bad guy. Okay, he's supposed to weigh the hearts of the deceased to find out if they're sinful, but it's a heavy feather. He gives people a pass on the little stuff. It's all good. You have to be pretty evil before you get your soul devoured by Ammit, the eater of souls. That's great. But then we remember that Anubis is bound by the expectations of those who believe in him. He is defined by those expectations. He is defined by the stories that are told about him. So who is responsible for this oddly heavy feather? Well, the answer can only be the people who believe in Anubis, the people who are proclaiming their belief in this ritual, in this tradition, in this testing of the worthy and the unworthy. The simple truth has to be that most people who believed in this ritual expected to be good. They knew their sins, they knew their wrongdoings and their misdeeds, but they also expected redemption. They also expected to be found good, to be found positive. And this, of course, speaks to us powerfully of one of the scenes in the TV adaptation, which I won't get into now, but if you have seen the TV adaptation, then I'm sure you're thinking of the same exchange that I am. It's extraordinary, it's beautiful, and certainly suggestive in its way. So here we see again, I think, that the gods are less possessed of agency than we might expect. It doesn't seem to me the case that Anubis can decide, okay, this is the job that I've been given, heavy feather. That's the right thing to do. That's the good thing to do. I want to let these people off. That's going to be just fine. Instead, we're informed by that expectation. We're bound by the myth that constrains him. And that is, in its own way, kind of tragic, even for a god who is apparently as at peace as Anubis is. Yeah, good. Yes, we're calling ahead to we're calling ahead to that. That's good. We had it made special. That British dry sense of humor, says Leslie Skipa. Yes, good, excellent. Let's keep pushing on then. Yes, because, well, okay, we'll have a throwaway first to Shadow's account of his growing up. Yes, this is Shadow remembering how he grew into his height, if you like. He had grown so fast. In the spring of his 13th year, the local kids had been picking on him, goading him into fights they knew they could not fail to win, and after which Shadow would run, angry and often weeping, to the boys' room to wash the mud or the blood from his face before anyone could see it. Then came summer. A long, magical 13th summer, which he spent keeping out of the way of the bigger kids, swimming in the local pool, reading library books at poolside. At the start of the summer, he could barely swim. By the end of August, he was swimming length after length in an easy crawl, diving from the high board, ripening to a deep brown from the sun and the water. In September, he had returned to school to discover that the boys who had made him miserable were small, soft things, no longer capable of upsetting him. The two who tried it were taught better manners, hard and fast and painfully, and Shadow found that he had redefined himself. He could no longer be a quiet kid, doing his best to remain unobtrusively at the back of things. He was too big for that, too obvious. By the end of the year, he was on the swimming team and on the weightlifting team, and the coach was courting him for the triathlon team. He liked being big and strong. It gave him an identity. He'd been a shy, quiet, bookish kid, and that had been painful. Now he was a big, dumb guy, and nobody expected him to be able to do anything more than move a sofa into the next room on his own. Nobody until Laura, anyway. Identity and redefinition. The redefinition of choice, but also the redefinition of fate. One of the things that I find most interesting about this passage is the degree to which Shadow's transformation can be attributed to his hard work and effort. He goes to the pool and he works out every day, basically. We're told that he swims again and again and again, while also reading books by poolside. Is he responsible for his transformation? Is his transformation something which is thrust upon him? That's an interesting discontinuity in our understanding of Shadow's character, but much more importantly, we have to look at the mutability of his identity. Shadow changes. His role fundamentally alters. He can't be the little kid, hanging out unobtrusively at the back. Now he is simply too big. Expectations change. Now he's not the little nerdy bookish kid. Now he's the big dumb jock. He can only be one of those two things, by the way. Those are the archetypes. Those are the roles that are selected for him to fit. And it takes someone special to see past that, i.e. Laura. We'll get back to Laura in due course. But that mutability of identity is something that makes Shadow very different from the gods with whom he is most recently keeping company, because Ibis and Jackal and Bat, they don't get that kind of sudden stark transformation. They don't get to change in that sense. They are defined by the expectations of others, just as Shadow is, but they don't get the same kind of agency about identity. They don't get to alter themselves, or even necessarily to understand that they can alter themselves. Yes. Jean says, the end of this passage breaks my heart, that when he was shy, quiet, and bookish, not just that it was painful, but that wasn't an identity. Yes. Or at least not an identity that he could assert as an identity, I suppose. Yeah. Good. Becca says, being a nerd was hard, being a jock was hard in a different way. Good. Yes, exactly right. And Shadow brought into the light by growth, says Angela. Good. Yes. Yes, and as Sarah points out here, being a jock nerd is the hardest. Yeah, that's fair. That's absolutely fair. Good. So, yes, so in the summer of Shadow's 13th year, he becomes different. He transitions into a new phase of his existence, though, as is implied by that punctuative and almost punitive final line, nobody until Laura anyway, we are clearly led to believe that this is not the last turning point for Shadow, that there will be another point of punctuation in his life, that he was the nerd, then he was the big dumb jock, then he was whatever he will be with Laura in terms of his history and his narrative. Yeah. So we'll keep following that too. But most powerfully, of course, this mutability is alien to the gods that Shadow is currently associating with. Good. Of course, we'll have the opportunity to talk more about Shadow's identity later in the book. From there, we move into Shadow's night of wild sex with Bast. Here we go. This is his dream sequence. My wife, Laura, she'll kill you. Not me, she said. A fragment of nonsense bubbled up from somewhere in his mind. In medieval days, it was said that a woman on top during coitus would conceive a bishop. That was what they called it, trying for a bishop. He wanted to know her name, but he dared not ask her a third time, and she pushed her chest against his, and he could feel the hard nubs of her nipples against his chest, and she was squeezing him, somehow squeezing him down there deep inside her, and this time he could not ride it or surf it. This time it picked him up and spun and tumbled him away, and he was arching up, pushing into her as deeply as he could imagine, as if they were in some way part of the same creature, tasting, drinking, holding, wanting. "Let it happen," she said, her voice a throaty, feline growl. "Give it to me. Let it happen." And he came, spasming and dissolving, the back of his mind itself liquefying, then sublimating slowly from one state to the next. Somewhere in there, at the end of it, he took a breath, a clear draft of air he felt all the way down to the depths of his lungs, and he knew that he had been holding his breath for a long time now. 3 years, at least. Perhaps even longer. "Now rest," she said, and she kissed his eyelids with her soft lips. "Let it go. Let it all go." The sleep he slept after that was deep and dreamless and comforting, and Shadow dived deep and embraced it. So this is Shadow's extracurricular sex with Bast, I suppose. This is his dream sequence, his quasi-dream sequence sex with Bast. When he awakes, he finds that he has been healed of his wounds, that he is no longer bruised, but he does still sport the scratches of his sexual encounter with Bast. Now, it would be irresponsible, I think, to talk about this scene in unequivocally positive terms, because what we are talking about here is forcible rape. This is a difficult scene from a moral perspective, because it is absolutely clear that Shadow has not given any kind of informed consent. Indeed, he protests throughout. He finds this a disquieting encounter until ultimately it isn't, but that doesn't change the issue of consent one bit. This is complicated, and if we had, it's a trivial thought experiment, right? Recast this. Have a male god coming to a young woman and seductively, having sex with her against her will, against her wishes, without her explicit consent. It's pretty tough, yes. Okay, we're clarifying here. Kate says, suddenly squeezing him. Did Shadow just discover women having pelvic muscles? I think the important part of that subclause is right at the end there. I'm looking for it here. Somehow squeezing him down there deep inside her. So I'm thinking that it is more, he is being squeezed at an unusual depth, I suppose we can say. It's not entirely, okay, it says, makes you wonder about Laura's technique. Fair. Becca says Gaiman really understands how to write love scenes. Yes, that he does, and sex scenes too, and combinations of those scenes. This is, I think, enormously powerful. We do get some interesting imagery here too. The bridge over the stream is enormously important. The recasting of Shadow in his prison cell is enormously important. There are questions here of the crossing of thresholds and of liminality, of course. Ultimately, it comes down to me to that line here, the antepenultimate paragraph on this slide. Somewhere in there, at the end of it, he took a breath, a clear draft of air he felt all the way down to the depths of his lungs, and he knew he had been holding his breath for a long time now. 3 years at least, perhaps even longer. 3 years, of course, takes us back to the beginning of Shadow's incarceration. So we know that that was a major turning point for him. Perhaps even longer is the most interesting clue that we get here. And this is part of why I wanted to talk about the first, why I wanted to talk about the first part of American Gods. These first 8 chapters form part 1 of the book. And if we're thinking about major turning points for Shadow, this kind of has to be, on the short list. This is one of the more significant experiences that Shadow is going to have around this time. And it works powerfully because it is restorative and it is healing. It is sex, it is sexual, it is sensual, but it isn't simply transactive. We're going to spend a little time with Wednesday in the next chapter, kind of being his lecherous self toward a young waitress. And that's a little less pleasant. And there certainly is the implication there that that is transactive in the sense of the giving of actual power, that Wednesday perhaps gains something from sex that isn't completely dissimilar to what Bilquis gains from sex. But there doesn't seem to be any association here between that kind of sex and this kind of sex. Not least of all because Shadow doesn't know that it's Bast. He doesn't know that what he is doing is considered by other gods, or could be considered by other gods, to be a kind of worship. Rather, she is caring for him. She is nurturing him. And as I said, doing so without his consent, which makes the whole thing a little icky. But nonetheless, it does seem to be at least well-intentioned. Jean says here, not to speak if Gaiman does this intentionally, fully or not, but by making Bast the instigator and perpetrator, it does subvert a common mythic framing of the power in sex. No, it absolutely does. This is one of the reasons I think that it's so easy to skate by issues of consent and issues of kind of moral responsibility in this scene, is because this kind of sex is so rare, is depicted so infrequently, that we don't really have the same kind of cultural framing for it. We don't have the same, red flashing lights that indicate, no, this is problematic. You have to stop and think about it for a second. And that's not just a question of female on male rape. It's also a question of the way that this book has instructed us to read it, the way that this book has taught us to read it. Shadow's dreams are oftentimes a little charged. This is not completely dissimilar from his encounter with Zoraya Polukhinaia on the rooftop. This is not completely dissimilar from his encounter, which turned out not to be a dream, I suppose, but from his encounter with Laura earlier. Shadow has an erotically charged relationship with women, and he has that relationship in the context of dreams and uncertainty. Certainly, waking up after Bast the following morning is not at all dissimilar to waking up after his evening on the rooftop with Zoraya Polukhinaia and finding the Liberty Dollar in his hand. So we have been cued to see this as something otherworldly, but if we are to assume that this happened literally, that Bast could transform herself, did transform herself into a female form, had sex with Shadow, scratched him up real good, and then sent him back to his room, that would be problematic from an issue of consent, from the perspective of consent. Yes, good. Yes. Okay, great. Sarah says, very dreamlike, but he has scratches, but the cat could have scratched him in the night. That would have been good. Oh, and Kate says, damn it, Zeus would have been a great name for a myth podcast, because we're complaining about Zeus transforming himself into a swan and just occasionally having sex with women. I mean, it happens from time. Look, who among us hasn't, is what I'm saying. Okay, what is most important, though? I don't want to get hung up on the sexual politics of the scene with Bast, though, as I've said, those are very, very important. But what is most important here is the depth of the restoration that Shadow experiences, and how this changes his character moving forward, how we are led to view him now, because we get this deep inhalation, this first deep breath that he has taken for at least 3 years, possibly longer. When he wakes in the morning, he finds himself healed. He finds himself restored. He is quite literally a new man. That's powerful. That's important because, well, for reasons of transition. Yes. Good. Okay. Yeah, as Leslie Skipa calls out here in the YouTube chat, his sexual encounters seem to end with him receiving gifts. Yes, that's interesting. Yes. So, and again, it may be possible to read too much into his encounter with Zoraya on the rooftop. It may be possible that while there is a chemistry there, and there is an odd kind of erotically charged subtext to that encounter, it isn't quite the same thing. But yes, and he's gifted, of course, the moon, which is of crucial importance, of critical importance. It's possible too, I think, and go with me on this, it's possible too to see his fight with Mad Sweeney as being of a similar nature, of being a similar kind of encounter. It's not sex, obviously, but it is an urgent physical encounter, and is also kind of representative, kind of fully expressive of a particular kind of, urgent physical relationship. So he fights Mad Sweeney and gets his coin, then he flirts with Zoraya Polukhinaia, gets her coin, now he has sex with Bast and gets her blessing. Maybe we can see these three things in some kind of continuum here. Yeah. Good. All right. Let's keep going, because we finally have to get to Mad Sweeney himself. The following morning, Shadow goes for a walk, and by the bridge on the way out of town, he finds the man himself. He leaned against the brick, fumbled in his pockets until he found the unfinished stub of cigarette he had abandoned earlier. He lit it carefully, trying not to burn his fingers or his beard. I'll tell you something, he said, as if he had said nothing that day. You're walking on gallows ground, and there's a hempen rope around your neck and a raven bird on each shoulder waiting for your eyes, and the gallows tree has deep roots for it stretches from heaven to hell, and our world is only the branch from which the rope is swinging. He stopped. I'll rest here a spell, he said, crouching down, his back resting against the black brickwork. Good luck, said Shadow. I'm fucked, said Mad Sweeney. Whatever. Thanks. Shadow walked back toward the town. It was 8 a.m. and Cairo was waking like a tired beast. He glanced back to the bridge and saw Sweeney's pale face striped with tears and dirt watching him go. It was the last time Shadow saw Mad Sweeney alive. The return of Mad Sweeney and the absence of Mad Sweeney's coin and the way that this narrative plays out is, I think, striking the first time that you're reading the book. When you find Mad Sweeney under the bridge and Shadow's joking about him being a troll, and he's obviously just out of his mind now. He's holding on by his fingernails, and there is no hope of restoration because he gave away the wrong coin, or Shadow took the wrong coin from the Horde. This is genuinely disquieting, because for the first time we are seeing a god, a supernatural being. We talked before about the degree to which leprechauns can be said to be or not be gods, but for the convenience of shorthand, we'll say a god. Here we are seeing for the first time a god destroyed, not forgotten, not dead in that sense, but here brought low. Sweeney is afraid. Sweeney is desperate, and Shadow cannot help him. And then, as Angela's calling out here in the YouTube chat, right here at the end of the slide, we get the foreshadowing. It was the last time Shadow saw Mad Sweeney alive. I mean, kind of. He's going to interact with Mad Sweeney a few times through the rest of the chapter, it turns out, but we can say unequivocally that Mad Sweeney is dead. And that's a part of Irish funeral practice, I suppose. You know, there's some interesting speculation about what is going on, about whether or not Shadow is imagining things, whether or not Mad Sweeney is really dead or not really dead, or what exactly is happening here. The fact that Mad Sweeney can talk to Shadow after his death is completely in accord with Irish funeral practice, particularly once we get to Ibis and Jackals and Shadow sets the extra place and pours the whiskey. That is, in Irish funerary custom, an explicit invitation for the absent person to rejoin the party, which is why we don't get any points of transition. It's why we don't get any ethereal moment when Mad Sweeney apparates through the wall and sits down, or any other kind of thing. It's simply the presence there, and I think it works really rather beautifully. Yes, as Angela calls out, the wrong gold coin, the coin for the King of America. Plans are going awry. Yes, yes. Sarah says Mad Sweeney is given short shrift in this novel. Yes, though, I mean, it's short but glorious, and I'm not sure that Mad Sweeney would object to that as either a life or a description. Of course, he isn't actually short. I'm making a leprechaun joke, which is, you know, possibly politically insensitive of me. Yeah, you're right. He's, considering how much time we spend with Mad Sweeney, he leaves an unforgettable impression on the book and on the reader, and ultimately, I think, on Shadow too. Let's skip ahead here because I am good. Yes, okay. Let's get to the recovery of Sweeney and the conversation that he has with Shadow. We still have a few slides to get through here before I wrap up. Though Becca Eller in chat, I really love the idea of setting a place for a departed friend and loved one. Yes, I really like that too. And Kate is asking, do you think Wednesday wanted him to have that coin? Well, that's a question, isn't it? How are we supposed to interpret Wednesday's actions back in the bar in the light of these new accusations? I don't know. I don't know is the thing. And certainly parsing out Wednesday's response to Shadow's account of Laura's return is complicated. So let's put a pin in that until we have more information about which we might that we might use to speculate. Good. Okay. The hearse was stopped at a traffic light, the same lights he'd fishtailed at several nights earlier, when Shadow heard a voice croak. And it's a fine wake I'll be wanting, with the best of everything, and beautiful women shedding tears in their clothes in their distress, and brave men lamenting and telling fine tales of me in my great days. You're dead, Mad Sweeney, said Shadow. You'll take what you're given when you're dead. Aye, that I shall, sighed the dead man sitting in the back of the hearse. The junky whine had vanished from his voice now, replaced with a resigned flatness, as if the words were being broadcast from a long, long way away, dead words being sent out on a dead frequency. The light turned green, and Shadow put his foot gently down on the gas. But give me a wake tonight nonetheless, said Mad Sweeney. Set me a place at table and give me a stinking drunk wake tonight. You killed me, Shadow. You owe me that much. I never killed you, Mad Sweeney, said Shadow. It's $20, he thought, for a ticket out of here. It was the drink and the cold that killed you, not me. I want to highlight here the traffic lights, the same lights he'd fishtailed at several nights earlier. Then the light turned green and Shadow put his foot gently down on the gas. We are seeing two things here which I completely adore. The first is that Shadow is learning. The first is that Shadow is changing and growing and gaining by experience. Shadow is becoming better and wiser than he was before. Secondly, through familiarity, Shadow is connecting with this place. Days have passed. He is now here. He is. It's almost Christmas. It is the 23rd of December, I believe, as we're moving through this sequence. He is connecting with Cairo, with Egypt, with Ibis, and with Jackal. He is learning this place. So he is learning both in the abstract sense. Hey, when it's icy, don't plant your foot. You'll fishtail. That's a bad thing to do. But he's also learning in the specific sense. This is where I am. This is how to live here. This is how to be here. This is how to be the Shadow that I am in Cairo, in the same way as I learned to be the Shadow that I was in prison, in the same way that I learned to be the Shadow that I was in Eagle Point, in the same way that I learned to be the Shadow I was at the swimming pool. He is continuing to change and continuing to evolve and arguably, possibly, hopefully mature. Of course, the interaction with Sweeney is just fantastic. Sweeney remains a vivid and vibrant character even in death, arguably even more so in death. And we're addressing here Shadow's culpability in giving him the $20. Did Shadow lead to the death of Mad Sweeney? Was it the $20? Was it the taking of the coin? Was it the losing of the coin? I mean, yes, yes, and yes. All three things contribute to that. It's $20 he thought for a ticket out of here. That's Shadow repeating to himself what it was that Mad Sweeney had said right there at the end of that last slide. But of course, Shadow questions it. A $20 ticket will get you where? And Mad Sweeney says it'll get me out of the path of the storm. It'll get me out. It'll get me out. But of course, it won't. And Shadow seems to know that. So here we're talking about his culpability. We're talking about his responsibility. And we're seeing, again, a transition from Shadow, because he's less reactive. When he returns to Ibis and Jackal and he throws the wake for Mad Sweeney, he is taking spontaneous action in a way that he really hasn't since the beginning of the book. From the beginning of the book, he's been bouncing from event to event to event, from reaction to reaction to reaction. Here, he's taken a breath. He has stilled himself. He has found a kind of peace, and now he is ready to take action. And he's ready to take action in the honoring of his friend, associate, someone for whom he certainly feels an amount of empathy, an amount of sympathy. Yes. Yes, Becca Eller says, you take what you're given when you're dead, and now I ugly cry. That's devastating. Yes, absolutely. Good. Good. All right. Let's oh, yes, one of my favorite parts of the chapter, with the finest Irish whiskey that the liquor store sold, which I can guarantee was not fine Irish whiskey. Let's get to the last slide that we have here this evening. I'm right on time. This is actually working out perfectly. Let's get to the last slide here. This is a sad wake for great Sweeney, who flew like a bird across all of Ireland and ate watercress in his madness. To be dead and unmourned, save for a bird, a dog, and an idiot. No, it is not a pouch. Well, that's pretty much it for ideas, said Shadow. I expect you just take them out of nowhere. It was meant to be sarcasm, but then he saw the expression on Sweeney's face. You do, he said. You do take them from nowhere. Well, not exactly nowhere, said Mad Sweeney, but now you're getting the idea. You take them from the Hoard. The Hoard, said Shadow, starting to remember. Yes. You just have to hold it in your mind, and it's yours to take from. The sun's treasure. It's there in those moments when the world makes a rainbow. It's there in the moment of eclipse, in the moment of the storm. And he showed Shadow how to do the thing. This time, Shadow got it. I adore this entire passage with everything that I've got. This is just one of my favorite exchanges. Everything from the horde, said Shadow, starting to remember. Yes, the sun's treasure. It's there in those moments when the world makes a rainbow. It's there in the moment of eclipse and the moment of the storm. And he showed Shadow how to do the thing. This time, Shadow got it. I loved it. Just absolutely loved it. So what do we make of the horde here? What do we make of this legendary treasure that we can Gene says, this is such a wonk book. Do the thing. Do the thing. He showed Shadow how to do the thing. This time Shadow got it. I love the kind of heavy-handed inelegance of it. Honestly, this is the "and Shadow said nothing" of this particular passage. This is our incredibly muscular, almost graceless, almost artless, but sufficiently graceless and artless that it takes on a kind of new grace and art. This is the simple musculature of Gaiman's prose, and I completely adore it. Princess Ostrich says, "How to do the thing, a tutorial by Matt Sweeney." Yes. And as Jonathan says, my interpretation was always that his death was the only way out of the storm. Oh, we're talking about the ticket here. Yes, that $20, yes, $20 isn't enough for a literal ticket out of town. It's not going to get him out of the way of the storm. That what's being suggested here is that Sweeney's ticket out of town, his ticket out of the way of the path of the storm, was the bottle and was the death. Yes, Jonathan, I think that's, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a completely valid and almost inescapable conclusion. I think you're completely right there. Yes, good pull. Good pull. Becca says, can these tutorials on YouTube, can these tutorials be on YouTube? This is referring to the doing the thing, a tutorial by Matt Sweeney. I can totally see this being good. I would absolutely love to see some Pablo Schreiber, I think, who plays Matt Sweeney in the TV show, could do some fantastic just do the thing tutorials. It would kind of be like a YouTube makeup tutorial coupled with that what is that? The video of the guy whose name is now completely escaping me. Good Lord, I'll circle back around to this later because his name will return to me the minute that I stop trying to think about him. Everything's fine, you guys. Everything's just fine. That is going to do it. I am out of time. This is where we are now. These moments of rainbows. The world makes a rainbow. It's there in the moment of eclipse, in the moment of the storm. This is perfect. This is absolutely perfect. Let's talk about what we're going to do next, because as I mentioned right at the top of the show, we are running a little behind. The schedule got a little confused. Tomorrow, that is Friday, May the 26th, we will release our episode for American Gods 104, Get Gone. That is the episode that was delayed from the beginning of this week. Our schedules just riotously fell apart. So I have sat down with Elizabeth and with Daphne. We discussed Get Gone, and we will release that episode tomorrow. Then on Monday, we will have the next episode of American Gods for 105, Lemon Scented You. And then on Tuesday, we'll come back for our next session on the novel, chapters 9 and 10. I'm hoping for chapters 9 and 10 because most of chapter 9 is an analysis of different cons, which I love, but which I can give a gloss to, is what I'm thinking. I can pretty much make that happen with reasonable rapidity, I'm hoping, anyway. He said optimistically without reason. Guys, I don't know. I'm going to do the best that I can. All right, that, I think, will do it for this time. Thank you all so much for joining me here in the YouTube chat. Angela says, that would be a fantastic tutorial. Sarah says, I want this thing now, guys. We'll get there. I promise. We'll get there. Someone somewhere will make something awesome. That's the rule of the internet. Good. I know Princess Ostrich says, oh, the cons. I know. I love it. But there's only so, I mean, I could just read it to you. Maybe that's what I'll do. Maybe I'll just read that chapter and put it out as a special little short episode, because besides reading it to you, there's really not that much that we can get from the cons themselves that can't be parsed in a slide or two. Yes. Pretty much a refresher on Leverage, says Jonathan Nash. Yes, I'm crazy for Leverage. That is a very good show. And the throwing around of the names of cons throughout the pages of American Gods absolutely reminds me of Leverage. That's a good show. All right, let's wrap it up there. Guys, thank you all so much for listening. I'll be back with you very soon. Until then, take care.